are back in the car on a Saturday morning like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Saturday morning here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Notice because the image is flipped, I led with my right hand. In my little opening there. And why did I do that? Well, yesterday, and I kind of ran out of steam last night. I wanted to do an episode on this gentleman that I'm going to talk about today. But yesterday marked the 71st, it would have been the 71st birthday of legitimately one of the 10 greatest boxers who ever lived. The man otherwise known as the Marvelous One, Marvelous Marvin Hagler. There are certain fighters throughout history who are not necessarily underrated, that they are an acknowledged great across generations of fighters from when they fought to younger fighters of today, watching old film and footage and whatnot. Marvin Hagler is someone who is not underrated, but I still feel like he was better than he's given credit for. In 65 professional fights, Hagler has 3 losses on his record. All 3 of those losses were disputed. There are very few fighters, and it's almost impossible to go through an entire career and do what, for example, Joe Calzaghe, Floyd Mayweather, of course, and Andre Ward, going through an entire career undefeated. Because you're going to have close decisions that you get the short end of the stick. It's the nature of boxing. And in the case of those 3 guys, and Calzaghe had a couple of tough fights, but I feel like he won most of his fights going away. Calzaghe was just an absolute unicorn of a fighter. And then you look at Andre Ward, he had some tough fights, and Floyd, there are people that are convinced that the Jose Luis Castillo fight was very difficult to score, and there were some that felt that Castillo landed the sharper punches, etc., etc. Understand? Marvin Hagler's 3 losses were all razor-thin decisions, including his final fight against one of the 4 Kings, a fellow legendary name, and a guy who is not underrated in any capacity, Sugar Ray Leonard. And there are people still angry the fact that Hagler got the short end of that decision. But you know what? There are certain fighters, and Ray was one of them, very, very difficult to score. Marvin Hagler, though, the leading with the right, he was a southpaw. But he wasn't just any old southpaw. He was a southpaw who had the range of skills necessary to switch back and forth between southpaw and conventional, a la Rocky Balboa. Yes, I switched to southpaw. No tricks, Mickey, no tricks. Hagler was more comfortable at southpaw. But if he had an opponent that he felt was susceptible to him leading with the left jab, for example, well, Marvin could do that too. And ironically, the fight with Leonard, Marvin decided to try to switch things up and confuse Ray by fighting conventional in the first 2 rounds. And I think it was Gil Clancy, he felt that Marvin probably cost himself those rounds. He said he should have just gone out and, Marvin, we know what he can do. He should have just gone out and fought his normal fight. But as somebody who grew up from a very young age, at least to some extent, a boxing fan, the first important fight that I saw live, I was 5, maybe 6. I think I was 5. When Marvin Hagler, the first time, he challenged for the World Middleweight Championship against a really tough son of a gun, Vito Antuofermo. Vito Antuofermo was the sort of fighter, he had a little bit of the Chuck Wepner thing. Wepner, of course, was the guy who, when he fought Muhammad Ali in 75, inadvertently inspired Sylvester Stallone to write Rocky, because he was a kind of a fringe contender / ham and egger who nearly went the distance with the champ and was credited with a knockdown in that fight, and that's what kind of spurred Stallone to write Rocky. But if we're being fair, he stepped on Ali's foot, and he just kind of reached out and poked at him, and it looked like a heavy knockdown because Ali went flying, but you're in the ring and you get tripped and you're going to go flying. But Vito Antuofermo was the kind of fighter who swelled faster than other fighters and cut more easily than most other fighters. And just as a kid, watching guys throwing bombs at each other for the better part of 15 rounds, I only remember flashes of it. I was so young. It was a big screen TV. We were at a friend's house. It was like an old school, it probably weighed 500 pounds, a 24 to 26 inch television. So that's a pretty good picture for the day. And I thought that Hagler beat the hell out of Antifermo. And certainly after the fight, Vito's face was marked and, very puffy and cut and everything. But it was scored a draw. And, given the fact that Marvin lost a really close decision to, was it Benny Briscoe was I think the closest one that he lost. And I don't remember the other fighter who outpointed Marvin early in his career, mid-70s. But it seemed to me that Marvin won that fight and it was scored a draw. And what's interesting in that is Marvin was not the kind of fighter who had fights that should have been difficult to score because he was an action fighter. He was somebody who could simply outbox you if necessary. But you want to get into a firefight with Marvin Hagler, good luck, because he was as tough as nails. And really the only guy after fighting him who didn't say words to that effect was Duran. And Duran was just mad because when he fought Marvin in '83, if that had been a 12-round fight, I think Roberto would have been credited with a decision, but it would have been massively controversial. The sense is that Hagler wasn't given enough respect by the judges of the day because there were a number of fights where he seemed to have won more rounds than he was credited with, and you could say he was lucky that he had a 15-rounder against Duran. And, Marvin got stronger as that fight went along. We're getting ahead of ourselves. Vito Antifermo ended up losing his middleweight title to a real tough Brit named Alan Minter. And I did not see Marvin Hagler versus Alan Minter live, but I knew of it. I think by that point I was six going on 7. And as tough as Minter was, again, the tendency with certain fighters to bruise and cuts to open up. And, one thing with Ali we always talk about is the fact that he seemed to be very good at opening up cuts because he was typically taller than his opponent and he threw these downward darts. That seemed to be effective at opening up cuts. And Marvin Hagler didn't do anything like that. He was just a bull, charging straight forward, wading right into the storm, and coming out on top. And the Alan Minter fight, and Minter came to fight. You watch that now, there's some really good footage of that particular encounter on YouTube, but Marvin he's just beating the hell out of him. And the thing with Hagler is, there are certain fighters throughout time who are known to have something like an iron jaw. And Hagler is one of them. Triple G is another. And we all remember, I think it was the first fight between, and of course Triple G, one of the great middleweights who ever lived, certainly in the top 5, I would think, if not the top 3. There are those that would say, hey, Prime Golovkin has a shot to beat Prime Roy Jones Jr. I don't know about that. I mean, Roy at middleweight was really tough. And maybe Golovkin and Hagler, man, that'd be a hell of a fight. But we remember in the first fight where Canelo landed, you got to say it, he landed the same kind of punch that knocked Amir Khan into another time zone. And that is not a knock, no pun intended, on Amir Khan. Because Canelo, when he winds up and he gets his leverage behind the punches, I mean, he could probably force a heavyweight to take a knee. He hits so damn hard. And Canelo landed a fucking howitzer on Triple G, and Triple G just ate it and walked right through it. I don't know how that's even possible, but Marvin Hagler was that kind of fighter. Where you go back and you look at that Minter fight, and Minter wasn't a huge man, he's middleweight, but Minter landed some shots that are supposed to at least move his opponent, make him rethink his position. Maybe I shouldn't come in, so maybe I need to back off. And no, Marvin just went forward and is banging away left, right, right, nothing, and opened up a pretty significant cut. And this is another thing with boxing, it's very tricky. It's a brutal sport. We know that. It's a brutal sport. There are certain kinds of cuts that are not going to end up in a stoppage. There are other kinds of cuts that are. Again, to reference Ali, the Henry Cooper fight, both of the Henry Cooper fights, the cuts were just too deep and potentially dangerous. I understand boxing is dangerous, and generally speaking, the repeated blows to the head, when you're already tired and fatigued and you keep getting hit in the head, that's more dangerous to your long-term health than even a deep cut, generally speaking. But if you have a jagged cut and a fighter is bleeding all over the ring, the ref's got to stop the fight. The ringside doctor's got to stop the fight. And when Hagler fought Minter, it was a very significant cut, and the announcers, I don't think it was Cosell, or maybe Cosell, but the broadcast that I've seen on YouTube did not have Howard, because Howard was still working a lot of the big fights at that, during that era. They stopped the fight, and Hagler won the World Middleweight Championship, I think undisputed by that point, with a stoppage. And the fans are throwing shit in the ring, and they were angry, and there was a sense that there could have been a little bit of a racial component to the fans' anger, but those are the kinds of arguments I'm not interested in. I'm just a guy watching a fight from 40 years ago for the first time, a number of years ago. I had never seen the fight between Hagler and Minter. But Marvin mostly had somewhat easy title defenses. Yeah, I remember when he fought Caveman Lee, that fight was over in a minute. That really wasn't a great idea. But he fought the best, and cliches with a lot of the other great fighters. Marvin didn't duck anybody. He went after everybody, whether it was, as I say, Simpson, whether it was giving Vito a return match, which was a stoppage on cuts again. Mustafa Hamsho, terrific fighter. Juan Roldan? I'm not sure if it was, I think Roldan was the guy credited with a knockdown. It was a little bit of I don't really know that was a knockdown. It was almost a little bit of a slip, and he happened to land a punch. I think the guy's name was Roldan. But he fought Fulgencio Obamejias, who was a great fighter. Like, this was not just he didn't fight random contenders. Whoever was the top contender, they put in front of Marvin. And Marvin fought, and usually dispatched easily. Because I remember before the Hamsho fight, I believe it was the late, great Ray Arcel, who had worked with Duran. He thought that Hamsho was actually going to beat Hagler. And it didn't end up being as competitive as a lot of people expected. So Marvin was just ripping people out of there, fighting that kind of bruising, brutal style, mixing the body work with the shots to the head. And not that he's trying to get hit, but willing to get hit. Because Marvin actually, if you look at his defense, defensively, he was very slick. He had good head movement for a guy that, you could hit him, but you better be ready for what's coming in return. He's going to hit harder than you, that kind of thing. But when people talk Hagler, when they go into his career, the fight that fight fans come back to, and even if we're talking about younger fans who maybe just know the name, we know that he's consistently listed among the greatest middleweights who ever lived. It's funny that I can't remember the name of the guy that Hagler was trying to break the record of, the middleweight champion from the 60s and 70s. I'm completely, too many colliding thoughts in the head. But the guy that Hagler wanted to get more successful title defenses than. But Marvin, we remember most the fight with Thomas Hearns. And the really unfortunate thing from the Thomas Hearns perspective is that Hearns was involved in 2 of the 5 greatest fights in the history of professional boxing. Like, if you ask, I don't want to say people like me, I'm just a guy who is a boxing fan. Like, I know more about movies, relatively speaking. I can be clear about that. I know a lot about the history of boxing, but once you get out of the 90s, my knowledge is nothing like what it is in the earlier, first part of the 20th century and all through the 1990s. But generally speaking, if you ask 100 experts or big fight fans from the historical perspective to name, what would you say are the 5 best fights? Just best. You don't have to go any further than that. A lot of people are going to name 2 fights involving Thomas Hearns. The first fight with Hearns and Leonard in September of 81 at Caesars, and Hagler Hearns. A lot of people are going to have that at number 1. That's the greatest fight ever. It's the closest thing that we're ever going to see to a Rocky movie. 2 all-timers close to their prime. I don't know if they were both exactly in their prime. Marvin was probably sharper in 82, and Hearns was not his best weight. Hearns had a lot more titles to win and lose after that. But it's just called The War now. It was also at Caesars. Hagler Hearns is nonstop action. It's a cliche, but it is 8 minutes of just 2 guys going at it. And 2 guys who were brilliant boxers, especially Hearns. Hearns had it in him to be he could just outpoint you. He didn't even have to try to square you up and take you out with a big shot. Hearns was a fantastic boxer. And he made a tactical mistake going to war with Hagler. If Hearns could do it again, he would have at least made an attempt to box, because at a certain point in the first round, he tries to, as they say, get on his bicycle, do a little, Ali, not exactly, but the movement with the legs, and to try to square Marvin up with the jab and a hand. Because the thing with Hearns is he threw these just vicious quick combinations. I mean, he was fast as lightning for a fighter who, when you first think of Hearns, you don't think of the speed, but God, that guy was incredibly fast with the way that he got those combinations, and he threw them like Larry Holmes. Holmes, another guy who was not really underrated, but in certain quarters, just how quick he delivered shots. High velocity, vertigo-inducing bombs. Thomas Hearns was just great. And as I say, it's unfortunate that he's most remembered for 2 fights he lost, where he gave a brilliant account of himself both times. He just sort of ran out of gas in the Leonard fight, and the Hagler fight, he fought Hagler's fight. But when I talk about cuts, Hagler got cut in the first round of that fight. I believe it was April 15, 1985. And I did not see that fight live, but I remember when it went off, if memory serves, it was one of the first pay-per-view events where fans, like WrestleMania, as dumb as this sounds, 2 weeks earlier, WrestleMania, the first WrestleMania, late March, I think it was the last Sunday in March, like March 31st, 1985. That was a pay-per-view event I was lucky enough to go to. My mom managed to get tickets at Madison Square Garden. But Hagler Hearns was a pay-per-view event. I was actually in St. Croix when it happened. I did not see it live. But that fight is an all-time, nobody ever disputes. Like, there isn't any big boxing aficionado who's not going to have that in their top 10, top 5, top 3, possibly even, no, that's the greatest fight ever. And in that fight, Hagler's cut in the first round, and Hearns loaded up and landed a shot that actually seemed to stagger Hagler. And that is in his entire career, or at least the footage, fights that recorded, because some of his early fights, there is no footage. It doesn't, as far as we know, it doesn't exist. It's all memory and, let's say, an Associated Press report of fight with Briscoe that he, lost the decision. I don't remember the other fighter who had beaten him. But he opened a cut, and he had a cut like on his forehead, and it was a strange spot for there to be a cut, and it was bleeding significantly. But as the announcers, and even I think it was Petronelli, Hagler's guy in the corner, when Richard Steele and the ringside doctor came over to look at him, I think it was Petronelli who just kind of snarled, even when he wanted to think about stopping the fight, he said it's not affecting his sight. If that same cut is on the brow, a cut as kind of dirty as that, the fight might have been stopped before Marvin was able to take him out of there. And the thing is, there did seem to be a sense of inevitability once you got out of the first round. Well, for starters, you knew this wasn't going 15. It wasn't going 15, no chance. But there was a sense that the only way Hearns could win was to get that kind of stoppage. You didn't expect, and look, shit happens in boxing that we don't know. We've seen crazy stuff and knockouts that appear to come from nowhere. But usually it's a fighter that is either known for big power, or the other guy isn't known for having a big chin, or something along those lines. But the sense was, if you listen to the announcers, one broadcast was, I think it was Ray Leonard. Was it Ray Leonard and Barry Tompkins? But then there was the other broadcast. I don't remember who the other one was. There's at least 2 that are available. I don't know if Bob Sheridan did one for the international audience. If he did, I didn't hear that. But there was an idea. It was Tompkins who screamed, oh, I'm sorry, Al Michaels did the other one. But there was a sense that Hagler was starting to walk Thomas down. By the end of the first round, Hearns was on the defensive. And Thomas even talked about, they did a special where he and Hagler, they weren't in the same room, but they kind of were both interviewed at the same time. And, both guys were wearing sunglasses because they had really taken a lot of damage. It wasn't that long after the fight. But there was a sense that, and Thomas Hearns even said, I tried to box, but my legs were already gone. His legs were gone in the first round because Hagler hit so hard. Hagler squared him up so many times. From a certain point of view, you could say that Hearns showed an incredible chin in that fight that he didn't drop in the first round, because Marvin loaded up at one point and landed a right hand. There's a lot of fighters where the fight's over from that one shot, or at the very least, it's a heavy knockdown where you're not sure, is this fight could be over right now. So Tommy showed that the grit and the toughness. But the only way he was winning was if that cut got so bad that the ref was going to have to stop it. But nobody wanted it to end like that. I know that's a cliche, but you got to let the guys go. Not affecting his sight, the cut, and that famous Sports Illustrated cover from the fight where the title of the cover was just marvelous with an exclamation point. You see the cut. It was like right there. It's just, I don't even know how that cut opened. I don't think it was an accidental headbutt. That would be one way. But once you got to the third round, there was a sense that it's just a matter of time. And it was just a matter of time. When we talk about, there are fighters that have such incredible spirit and will to win that even when they're unconscious, almost literally unconscious, there is something deep in the wiring, in the internal circuitry of a warrior. They're just going to get up. And the way that Hagler, the shots that Hagler landed for the knockdown, which was basically the end of the fight in the third round, Hearns was unconscious, and somehow he's on his feet at 9. And I hate to be cynical. I'm not really a cynic, or I'm not as cynical as most of my fellow Gen Xers. But there was a time in history where that fight would have been allowed to continue. It wouldn't have gone more than a few more punches. I understand that. But it would have been allowed to continue simply because Thomas was on his feet at 9. And I remember the Ray Leonard broadcast where Leonard basically said something like he's gone, meaning fight can't continue. One way or another, he's got to stop the fight. And Richard Steele, who unfortunately 5 years later took an unbelievable amount of criticism for the Julio Cesar Chavez Meldrick Taylor stoppage, but Richard Steele doesn't know how much time is left, and he stopped that fight with, I think, less than 5 seconds because Meldrick was just getting killed in the corner. He was getting smashed. Yeah, if he knew there were 2 seconds left, he probably would have done something stupid, maybe separate the fighters to let the bell ring. I don't know what he could have done different other than just let Meldrick continue to get slammed there. I mean, that was an incredible fight in its own right. But in this case, Hearns somehow got up, and Al Michaels' call on that knockdown is really good. And I know Al Michaels is most famous for Do You Believe in Miracles? Yes, from 1980, the hockey, and certainly football, great football announcer, good with baseball. But his call, as Hearns tries to get up, was just incredible. But Richard Steele immediately stopped the fight. It didn't matter that the fighter was on his feet. And you think of Ruby Goldstein with the Emil Griffith-Benny Perrette fight and some other fights in history where the ref's got to put his arm around the fighter and stop this. This is not, you can't let this fight go on any longer. And Steele's stoppage there, it's easy to say now, well, of course he was going to stop the fight, but there are plenty of fights historically where the ref didn't. And in the case here, it's a big fight. Everybody is watching it. 2 all-time greats. They were already all-timers. And all the money on the line. Steele did the right thing. And nobody said, oh, what the fuck, you got to get a full knockout. But it was still a perfect stoppage. And, you know, that took a lot out of Hagler. That fight took a lot out of Hagler. And he was already, I mean, he wasn't old. He was 31. Had he even turned 31? I don't think that he had turned 31 yet. And there's a really nice moment after the fight, you know, because Marvin was just so mean in the ring and all that. And they brought his daughter into the ring to kind of give him a kiss. And the daughter said something like boo-boos. He says, yeah, you see daddy boo-boos. Yeah, what are you going to do? You know, almost making a joke about the fact, yeah, I got marked up here. Tommy fought a hell of a fight. You know, don't take any credit away from him. But after that, Hagler only fought twice more. And if Hagler Hearns was the peak of his career, which I think most people would agree, even if he was not technically still in his prime, he was very close. I mean, I would say it's at least 95% Hagler. Was he as good as when he beat Tony Simpson? I don't know. I mean, how could you even judge something like that? We could say he's if he's not in his prime, he's maybe a whisker past. And Tommy was still, you would have to say, was in his prime or also very close. But Tommy Hearns came up as a welterweight. He wasn't a natural middleweight, and when you move up weight classes, that's why it's so difficult to judge who's better, because Tommy Hearns as a welterweight in his prime, would you want Floyd Mayweather against Thomas Hearns in 1981? I'm taking Thomas Hearns. As great as Floyd is, he's a killer at welterweight. I mean, Hearns took no prisoners. There's a reason why there were a lot of people that had him favored to beat Ray Leonard. Even in the way that Leonard had he fought Duran almost to a standstill. Roberto got the decision in the first one, tough fight. But the second one, the way Ray came back, amazing. But Hearns was a great all-time welterweight. I would certainly say prime versus prime at welterweight, he's got to be in the top 5, maybe the top 3. He was just fucking merciless. You're not supposed to hit that hard. at that weight. But again, the long arms and the just lightning fast way he could deliver those high velocity shots. No pitter pat punches. He jabbed with intent. It was a Larry Holmes or Sonny Liston jab. And then coming in with that right. Whew. But Hagler's next fight was a real tough fight against another guy. He didn't duck. He didn't have to fight him. He could have avoided him. John Mugabe, the Beast. Now, John Mugabe had a very short prime. Unfortunately, the Hagler fight presumably took a whole lot out of him, even though he was so young. And that Hagler ended up beating Mugabe by 11th round. He took him out in 11. And Ray Leonard and Hagler they had been friends because it didn't look like they were going to fight. When Ray left the sport, he came back from the detached retina and he had a fight against Kevin Howard, which he really didn't look that good, at least by his standards. I mean, he won the fight, but he took a knockdown. And I think that was the first time that Ray had been floored in the pro ring. And so it didn't look like he and Hagler were ever going to fight. They supposedly had like a champagne dinner, with family, and they were telling stories about here's how I think the fight would go or would have gone. And they were on friendly terms. And then Ray saw something in the Mugabe fight, I guess. And he said, if I get myself together, I don't know that I'm going to knock this guy out, but I think I might be able to be competitive, and I think I'm going to beat him. When he convinced himself, I can beat him at middleweight. Let's go. And Hagler, more than happy. All right, Ray, we're going to do it. Let's go. Let's make a lot of money, pal. But let's go out there, give the fans a show. I'm going to beat your ass, whatever he says. Because Hagler wasn't really much of a trash talker. And Ray could talk, but there really wasn't much of a hard edge to his words. They didn't need to sell the fight. So I don't even know who said what before the fight. But I think the fact that Hagler somewhat struggled and Mugabe had his moment. Mugabe even said, I hit this guy with punches that should have ended the fight. And he didn't even look like I moved him. Didn't even look like I shook him up. I don't understand, because if you look at the size of Mugabe, he was enormous for a middleweight. He didn't look like any middleweight I've ever seen. He looked like he weighed about 180 in there. So when Hagler and Ray fought, it was a tactical fight. Neither guy looked particularly great, but Ray was terrific always at stealing rounds, and Ray was okay just scoring points. It's not that he wasn't trying to get Hagler out of there if an opportunity to square him up presented, but Ray knew this was not his best weight as far as power. He's out there to try to win the fight one way or another. And I didn't see this fight live. I saw it. There was a tape delay. I think HBO showed it a day or a couple of days later. My unofficial scorecard at age 13, I had Marvin winning it. I had it like 7-5 Marvin. I thought that he actually won one of the first two rounds that Gil Clancy thought that he had blown. I thought that he landed enough shots in round 2 to take that round. But that fight is impossible to score. They gave Ray the decision. Hagler was always, he was mad at the time, and then he was mad in later years. But you know what? It got Hagler to retire at the right time. And he passed in 2021. I guess it was heart issues. But Hagler got to live the life that he wanted to in retirement. He had bristling good health for decades. For 32 years, 33 years. He seemed to be in really good health. He lived in Italy for quite some time. He made a couple of movies. It looked maybe he'll become a movie star. That didn't happen. What was the movie? Inzio? I forgot the name of it. He had a big role in the late 80s. I guess he wanted to try to go the way of Jim Brown, but that's still better than getting punched in the head 300 times. He got to do what he wanted in retirement. And in later years, it was always great to see him, when they were like honorariums for certain other fighters and, Boxing Hall of Fame, if they got together, to see him with his old rivals, to see him smiling and embracing, literally, with his arms around Duran and Leonard and Hearns, and then the younger fighters of that, that later era, like De La Hoya, like Floyd Mayweather. Everyone respected Hagler. He was born not the best of circumstances. He grew up in Newark, New Jersey, but there are a lot of cliches. His career, his toughness was forged through circumstance, forged through iron. And he was one of the greatest to ever lace up the gloves. And I think, if you want to make the case, is he the best middleweight ever? It's so difficult. How do you compare Roy Jones Jr. to Marvin Hagler? Who do I think would win with prime versus prime? I think Roy wins more than half the time. Now, it would be tough for Roy because, Hagler could square him up. And I feel like most people would agree, although it was very difficult. See, this is again where you get into the body weight thing. Roy at the higher weights was easier to get him out of there. Roy at middleweight, there weren't too many times he got hit square and it even registered. So he absorbed shots from 160 pounders that guys who were 175, 180, it's a big difference. It's a big difference getting hit by a bigger guy. But I think I would have my money if it was a round robin tournament where they fought each other 100 times. Again, it couldn't happen. It's a computer simulation. Hagler, Triple G, Roy Jones Jr. at middleweight. My money would be on marvelous Marvin Hagler, one of the greatest to ever lace up the gloves. Marvin Hagler, born 71 years ago yesterday. This has been episode 518 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Saturday morning here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Until then, peace.